Okay. So the aims, like the objective of today's lesson, okay, is going to be basically for you to understand what like what active pregnancy is actually as a concept. I want you to understand like how to to see a patient or how to manage a patient of active pregnancy, and to know about the evolution of the disease per se. So you'll get an idea of how to treat the patient, and once you get this basic knowledge, you'll be able to use your knowledge to either solve MCQs or write a essay question or whatever. Okay. So as final MBBS students, you might have an essay as asking about active pregnancy, right? Or you might have a short note on active pregnancy. That is it. And for interns or like post interns who are attending NEET, active pregnancy per se does not have many questions. Okay, you won't be having many questions in active pregnancy. The only question, one or two questions you might have based on the treatment or the management part of active pregnancy, right? So if anyone has any questions, just mention that in chat. Okay, so I can actually see those questions and all. Okay, so ectopic pregnancy, like the definition of ectopic pregnancy, it's like in the name itself you can find out what it is. Okay, ectopic means that the location of the pregnancy is somewhere away from the normal site. Okay, so what is ectopic? Okay, for example, for you to call a ectopic pregnancy as ectopic pregnancy, what is it actually? Okay, so you will have certain normal locations in ectopic pregnancy. So what are those normal locations? That is, you have a uterus, right? You have a uterus and you have fallopian tubes. So, and this is the cervix. So in this uterus, you have the endometrium, and this endometrium is going to be the normal site of implantation of the embryo. Okay, so any place other than this is going to be ectopic pregnancy. So implantation of the embryo in any other location is going to be called as an ectopic pregnancy. Does not matter if it is a like it was in the tube or in the ovary or the cervix or any place. Okay, so this is about ectopic pregnancy. So these are the topics which we are going to discuss today. History, definition, incidence, and all this stuff, risk factors and clinical presentations, diagnosis, treatment, and other non-tubal ectopic pregnancies. Okay, so you have to know about history. Okay, the reason why I talk about history so much is because it will tell us how much like we have struggled to learn about one particular topic, to find out the treatment for one particular disease. Okay, so for like in the history of surgery, surgery per se has developed as a field only after gynecology. The initial first surgeries were basically surgeries for ovarian tumors and ovarian masses and so forth. So general surgery as a field developed only after gynecology developed. Okay, so you need to understand that surgery was developed in such a way that the surgical principles and all was based on experimenting with gynec surgeries. Okay, so you should this person called Kelly is actually a very important person, right? Kelly is actually the person who has invented many instruments, and there's an instrument called Kelly's forceps named after him. So what he told was, if you find a condition which does not follow any rules or does not conform to any standards, you should think about either ectopic pregnancy or pelvic tuberculosis, which is very right. Because most of the time you will not understand what is going on. And the symptomatology and the presentation will be very different. And for one condition, you will have various different presentations. A patient can have no problems at all, or a patient can have severe life-threatening problems. That is completely unpredictable for both these conditions. Okay. So one more thing is with our, currently in our scenario, if you go to the emergency department, if there's a patient, if there's a young woman in the reproductive age group complaining of abdominal pain, the surgeons will send it to gynecology because they'll think the most common causes will be a gynec cause. The gynecologist will send it to a send it to a. I'm sorry, this please don't mark in the screen, okay? Just I'll disable that. Okay, so as I told, no, like the in gynecologist will think that it's a surgical cause, right? So this is something which you should have into mind always. So any patient in the reproductive age group will, if he comes, most common cause would be a gynecological cause only, right? So have that in the mind. And one more thing is, like, if you think about ectopic pregnancy, always keep thinking about it. Can I ask whoever marked this, please remove the annotation, because it's like it's disturbing me. Yeah. Okay. So next thing is going to, like, we'll find about what exactly happened with the history of ectopic pregnancy. Okay. First thing is, in 1809 was the history where the first documented surgery for abdominal surgery was done. Okay. First elective abdominal surgery was done for a ovarian cyst. That is why I kept telling you the first surgery was done for a gynecological condition, right? And then what happened was, in 1880, Dr. Tate was actually referred a case of ectopic pregnancy by a medical practitioner. Okay, and this particular doctor did not want to do surgery at that point of time. He in his, there's a textbook when it is mentioned that after this patient, who with ectopic pregnancy, she came and she died because she was not done surgery for. After doing the postmortem for that patient, Dr. Tate found embryo in the tube, and which had ruptured, which had caused intraperitoneal hemorrhage. Thereby the patient died. And Dr. Tate felt very bad, because had he just done that surgery, the patient would have survived. Because understand that till this point of time, a surgery for ectopic pregnancy was never done. Okay, and almost always patients with ectopic pregnancy died till that point of time. There were only a few people who survived because they were lucky, and how they were lucky, I will tell you in the later class, in the following few minutes. Okay, so what happened was, like, after that, in 1 year, the Dr. Tate had a similar patient, but again, like, that patient could not survive the surgery. That patient died. And 8 years after that, Dr. Tate did the first salpingectomy for a case of ectopic pregnancy, and the patient survived. Okay, so understand one more important point, that all these things happened in the pre-antibiotic era and pre-anesthetic era. Okay, so till this point of time, there were no anesthesia, there was no antibiotics, and there were no blood transfusions. Okay, blood transfusions were also not yet developed, and Carl and Steiner actually found the blood groups in around early 1900, and it took a few more years for them to find out the RH blood groups also. Right. So this is going to be the history. Also, one more thing is, Dr. Tate was the first person to do appendectomy in the year 1880, but he did not report it till 1890. Okay, so there was another doctor who did appendectomy, and he reported it much more earlier. So he was documented as he was the first person to do appendectomy, but based on after evidences, we found that Dr. Tate was the first person to do a appendectomy. This is just for a trivia fact, right? So we'll go in for definition of ectopic pregnancy. So what is the definition? Ectopic pregnancy is actually an extrauterine pregnancy where the blastocyst, this is the important keyword, implants anywhere other than the endometrium lining the uterine cavity. So this is what I was telling you in that particular image. I told you, right? Like, this is you're going to have a normal endometrium, and anywhere implantation happens other than this place, it is going to be called as an ectopic pregnancy. So this is the definition which is given in Williams Gynecology, right? So what are these? See, and the one more thing is, like, based on you will not have any MCQs in NEET based on the incidence of ectopic pregnancy. The reason is it is a very variable number. Okay, and it will vary according to many risk factors, and those are the risk factors which are mentioned here. Okay, because comparing previous years, previous few generations, the like transmission of sexually transmitted diseases have increased. Okay, this has happened because of globalization and other like cultural changes, and diagnostic tools have improved. By diagnostic tools, they mean ultrasound. Okay, because ultrasound was introduced to obstetric practice in early 1950s to 1960s. Okay, but still then it was not clinically available. It was a very expensive machine, and even now it is a very expensive machine, and it is not available clinically in many places. Okay, so that was also a difficulty, because the more you test, only you can find the patients. That is what exactly our US President Trump keeps telling. The more we are having more tests because we do more tests. Similarly, only if you have an ultrasound device which you can screen, you can actually pick up more cases of ectopic pregnancy. Okay, and tubal factor of infertility, which is also an important factor. Okay, and that I'll explain all that in detail. The next thing would be like delayed childbearing and accompanied use of ART, assisted reproductive technology. All this is because of our changing lifestyle modifications and our work ethics and all. Okay, so and the next thing is going to be the increased use of intrauterine devices for contraception and tubal sterilization. All these like forms of sterilizations were not done previously. No, they were not very popular previously, and IUDs and all were started to be in use only in the after 1970s. So you can see the incidence of ectopic pregnancy increasing after this period of 1970, 1980 because of the regular use of IUCDs and treatment for ART for infertility. Okay, so the next thing will be risk factors, right? For risk factors, you have these are the most important risk factors which I have mentioned here, right? First thing is, like, if a patient has a history of ectopic pregnancy, the risk of her having ectopic pregnancy is much more higher. So a patient with previous 2 ectopic pregnancies will have a risk of 10 to 16 times higher compared to a normal person. Okay, and smoking is also going to increase the risk of ectopic pregnancy. Smoking increases it in many ways. First is it alters the oocyte cumulus complex pickup. What is this oocyte cumulus complex pickup? I'll mention that. Okay, so suppose like you have just a minute. Okay, so you are having a fallopian tube. You are going to have the fimbria. Okay, and then you will have the ovary. Right. You will have the ovum in the Graafian follicle, and those follicles will come and rupture. Once they rupture, they'll release an ovum. This is going to happen in every menstrual cycle. Okay, for this ovum, which is just a can you just tell in chat or something that if can you hear me or not? Hello, guys. People, I want you to interact in chat with me so that I can find out what is going on, because I can't find out if there's any problem with the connection or not. Yes. Okay, so I'll continue. So what I was telling was about the altered oocyte cumulus pickup. So what happens is, if there's any issue, just let me know, because I think connection is a bit difficult, like bad. Okay, so this oocyte will be picked up at the fimbria. Okay, this is both a physical process plus a chemical process, because there are a few chemical mediators, few like chemotactic factors also involved in this particular process. Okay, smoking will alter that homeostasis, thereby it will alter the oocyte cumulus pickup. Okay, second would be the ciliary dysfunction. You will have cilia along the inner surface of the fallopian tube, and those like that, the motility of that cilia will be affected by smoking. Okay, that will also be affected by other syndromes like cartilaginous syndrome and primary ciliary dyskinesia. Okay, so this is going to be one other method, and the other one is you will have smooth. Okay, The smooth muscle will also get affected, and that will also cause like problems with the motility of the ovum. So, what is the relationship between smoking and STD? Smoking, like things like there's association that patients, like people who are more sexually active, who are having a lifestyle which is more like promiscuous, they tend to smoke a lot. Okay, so there is an association that people who smoke will also sexually active. That by both of them are increasing the concomitantly increasing the risk of smoking. Okay, of actual pregnancy. Other one is patients who smoke are usually do require ART after conceiving for conceiving. So both of them again each individually increase the risk of actual pregnancy, and together they increase the risk of actual pregnancy. Okay, so that is that. And the next thing would be ART, artificial reproductive technology. So or techniques. Thing is like what is a transfer? So when you are going to do when you're going to do an IVF cycle, you will actually implant 2 to 3 embryos together. Usually they won't do one single embryo. That is because they each all of it as a failure rate, and to prevent now like more failure and to increase the risk, increase the chance of conceiving, they'll do implantation of 2 to 3 embryos per se every time. Okay, so one transfer has a risk of 0.8%, and once if it is successful, the risk will increase to 2.2% per clinical pregnancy. Okay, and older women have a more risk, that is 3 times more risk than compared to younger women. That is also there, right? And contraception is a very tricky place. Okay, wow. Contraception, what happens is, if the contraception fails with a few contraceptives like progesterone only pills or intrauterine contraceptive devices, the risk of getting active pregnancy increases much more. Why the reason? Because is progesterone will decrease the tubal mobility, thereby it will increase the risk of active pregnancy. That is why progesterone only pills and IUDs, especially LNG IUS, which is called as the levonorgestrel intrauterine system. Okay, these things will increase the risk of ectopic pregnancy. Okay, this is the risk factors. So we'll go to the classification of ectopic pregnancy. What is the classification of ectopic pregnancy? Uh, so ectopics is divided mainly into two things: tubal and non-tubal, right? Uh, so the non-tubal will have many subclassifications, and for all the non-tubals of subclassification, the treatment is going to be surgical. Okay, understand that. So surgical management is going to be the mainstay of treatment for all the non-tubal methods or types of active pregnancy. And in tubal, you will have both surgical and medical, right? I'm going to request you to mute yourselves. People who are not like others, please mute yourselves because I'm getting interference from others. Okay, so based on the non-tubal sites, you can have ovarian, which is going to be 3%. Okay, tubal is going to be 95 to 96%. Ovarian is going to be 3%. Rest will be around 1% or so, 1% and even less than that, right? So this is going to be the types of ectopic pregnancy. Okay. So I'll show you an image and where you can see the types much more clearly. Yeah. So in this image, you can see the different types of ectopic pregnancy. This is the image given in Williams Gynecology. Okay. Yeah. So here you can have the tubal ectopic, which is going to be, as I said, 95 to 96%. And then you're going to have interstitial or cornwall. See, all these are going to be a part of the ectopic pregnancy, right? And you're going to have ovarian, which is around 3%, cervical, cesarean scar, and abdominal. Okay. So what is the reason for ectopic pregnancy? other than tubal damage. Okay, why? And like in some cases, why is there tubal damage? Why is there tubal damage, and why is it causing a pregnancy? Okay, that is what we are going to deal in this particular slide. Okay, so when you have sorry, this one. Okay, so when you have inflammation, what happens is you will have like a formation of fibrin deposition, and that will actually cause the tube to become small. Okay, so when it decreases the size of the tube, like size of the like canal in the tube, it is going to obstruct the zygote from going inside. Okay, so that is going to be the cause. So you will have acute inflammation and chronic inflammation. In acute inflammation, the cause is most commonly going to be Neisseria gonorrhea. Okay, Neisseria gonorrhea is going to be a endotoxin producing gram-negative cocci, and this is going to cause virulent pelvic infection. Okay, so this is going to be very painful and it's going to be very, very acute. Okay, and the chronic is going to be mostly caused by chlamydia. Okay, so chlamydia infection is going to cause chronic like inflammation, and understand that it can be either recurrent or persistent. The difference between these two is when there is recurrent infection, it will cause like consistent like inflammation, and that will cause intraluminal shrinkage, and it will happen with 7 to 14 days of infection. Persistent infection is when there is you are giving antibiotic to the patient, and the antibiotic will actually act and destroy the bacteria, and it will actually kill the chlamydia, but the patient will be culture negative. Okay, in spite of that, the patient will have continued scarring. That is because of point of a delayed hypersensitivity reaction to the antigens of chlamydia. Okay, so these are going to be the two causes in inflammation. Okay, and one more thing is this is receptor called cannabinoid receptor 1, CB1 in the fallopian tube, which is going to be affected by chronic exposure to nicotine. So smoking cigarettes is going to affect that, and can affect if the cannabinoid levels of the end of a body, which is like the endogenous cannabinoids, are also going to be affected. That will happen if you keep smoking weed. Okay, so when you like smoke weed also, it will get affected. So this is so smoking anything will cause acute pregnancy. Okay, and E-cadherin will be affected in IVF. That is a bit deep for you, that you won't require. But just remember, in case you ask a question or MCQ about which is the marker which is going to affect or cause acute pregnancy, you can tell that it is going to be E-cadherin. Right. Okay. So based on that, I have another slide in pathology. Right. This is going to be about the pathogenesis. What are the different types of pathogenesis? Okay. So here we'll have eight particular points. Okay. So what are the congenital causes? Congenital causes, you will have an accessory ostrea. It's not just a normal ostrea, accessory ostrea. Thereby the fallopian, like the embryo gets lodged there or like goes out from the ostrea to somewhere else. Okay. So for example, if the fallopian tube from the uterine end has one ostrea here and one ostrea in this side, near the fembria. So it can ovum can enter via this way and get exit via this way. So that can cause ectopic pregnancy. And diverticula, like any other patient, like when you have colonic diverticula and all, the fallopian tube can also have diverticula. Okay, enlargements and all, wherein the zygote or the ovum can come and get lodged or implanted here. Stenosis I've already mentioned, like many inflammations will cause stenosis of the fallopian tube. Again, polyp and fibroid, these will cause obstruction in various levels. So the polyp or the fibroid can cause obstruction of the zygote to enter into the uterine cavity, but it can allow the sperm. For example, if this is going to be a fibroid or a polyp, the sperm can enter this way. Okay, the sperm can enter this way, but the ovum or the zygote cannot enter by this because this is going to block. So in that case scenario, it can cause ectopic pregnancy in the tube. Okay. So, and one more thing is going to be the transperitoneal migration. What is transperitoneal migration? Okay. Suppose the patient is going to ovulate from her right ovary. That ovum can actually come to the left side and get picked up at the left fallopian tube. Okay. And in this process, the ovum can be fertilized here or anywhere alongside. And this is going to be the reason for 8% of the ectopic pregnancies. Okay. And so this will come to you can actually come to a conclusion that you can learn about, the patient can actually conceive when she is having one ovary and one tube of the opposite sides. For example, you're having a patient, okay, let us say she has ovary on both sides and one ovary, this ovary, let us say, has like been removed for any ovarian cyst in the past. Okay, so this ovary has been removed. Okay, and this tube has also been removed, for example, some other condition like saphengitis or like previous secondary pregnancy. Okay, so this ovum can actually ovulate and this patient can conceive via normal mechanisms by the ovum being picked up by the opposite side fallopian tube. Okay, so that can happen, but this will actually decrease the chances of normal conception. So most often this patient will have to go for in vitro fertilization, right? The third point is going to be impaired peristalsis. As I told, like progesterone pills, smoking, and symptoms like primary ciliary dyskinesia and cardiogenic syndrome is going to affect the ciliary and peristaltic function, and that may cause ectopic pregnancy. Okay, and other reason is going to be appendicitis. I want you to understand that appendicitis is going to be a very, very tricky problem with a young female of reproductive age group. Okay, the reason is I'll tell you why. Okay, let me give you a case scenario. Right, you are going to have a 24-year-old female. Okay, so you are going to be in your casualty and you're going to have a 24-year-old female coming to you. Right, and that female will come, that patient will come and tell you that, sir, I am having abdominal pain for the past maybe 1 or 2 days, whatever. Okay, so your patient will come with a history of pain, abdomen, and she'll tell, sir, I had vomiting. Okay, so vomiting will be there, and then they can tell that I even had mild fever. Okay, so what is this triad or this symptom with abdominal pain? What is this most commonly a triad for? What do you diagnose this as when you are having a patient? Can anyone tell me? Can anyone text me in chat and ask me to tell me what is the most common diagnosis that comes to your mind? Guys, okay, I'm not getting any answers from chat. So you can either think about it. Okay, someone has told. Okay, Murphy's appendicitis, Murphy's. See, Murphy's is not going to be the diagnosis. Okay, appendicitis is going to be the diagnosis. Okay, what if I tell you this patient is going to have, okay, what if I tell you this patient is having a like ectopic pregnancy on the right side? Can that happen? Can this patient have ectopic pregnancy on the right side? Yes or no? This patient, this can also be a ectopic pregnancy. Okay, that is why we have a rule in gynecology that you do a UPT for any reproductive male, any reproductive female, like any patient who's in the reproductive age group, we are going to do a UPT even if they are on contraceptive, either if they're having IUCD or even if they are sterilized, because sterilization failure can also present as ectopic pregnancy. Okay, and if you miss this diagnosis, you miss the patient will die. That is why even if the patient has been sterilized, you do a UPT in any gynecological condition. Okay, if they're coming with symptoms of pain, vomiting, fever. Okay, so let us say, like as you said, this patient is having appendicitis. What is the relationship between appendicitis and ectopic pregnancy? Thing is, when you're having appendicitis, that location, that appendix, that area is going to have lot of neutrophils. Okay, that those neutrophils are going to like produce chemotactic factors for like to bring in all those neutrophils and all. Okay, those chemotactic factors will interfere with the chemotaxis of the ovarian the ovum, and that can interfere with the fertilization and thereby can cause ectopic pregnancy. Okay. Also, there is a little bit of anatomical variation on the right side. The ovary, the tubal anatomy and the lymphatic anatomy is a little bit different from the on the right side than the left side. So the incidence of ectopic pregnancy is more on the right side than on the left side. Okay, so I want you to know this also, right? And the next thing will be tubal surgery. Like as I told you, previous history of tubectomy, tuboplasty. Tubectomy is basically going to be a sterilization. Okay, tuboplasty is going to be like you like it's like going to be recanalization. That can also be tuboplasty, or you can actually do like if there's a block in the tube, you can actually use a small catheter to like remove the block, and that can also be applied as tuboplasty. And cauterization and ligation. Okay, so can you guys tell me what is going to be the most common method of laparoscopic sterilization? What is the technique or what is the like device used to do laparoscopic sterilization? Can anyone tell me that? Anyone? No one. Okay, so what is the most common cause? Most common way of sterilization is going to be tubal like ligation using a fallope ring. Okay, so you're going to have a ring called fallope ring, and you're going to use that to ligate the tube. Okay, what is the problem with cauterization? See, when you're having a fallopian tube, okay, and you're going to cauterize it. Thing is, this cauterized place can actually form a fistula. Okay, wow. So you have the ovary on this side and the uterus on this side. So when you cauterize, no, suppose there's a fistula, like they have these places are separated. Okay, so this forms a fistula, right? Ovum comes here, sperm comes here. The ovum can get like impregnated here. The zygote can form here. The zygote can form here, or both of them can spill and they can form a zygote somewhere in the abdominal cavity also, or in the ovary. This is going to be called as it is going to be one of the reasons for active pregnancy. So that is why cauterization as routine for sterilization is not being done routinely. Okay. Other common cause is going to be adhesions and endometriosis. Okay, these are going to affect the anatomy of the pelvis, thereby causing increased risk of active pregnancy. IVF I already mentioned, and contraception also I already mentioned to you. Okay, so these are going to be the various causes of pathogenesis of ectopic pregnancy. Okay. Okay. So, what is going to be the clinical presentation? Clinical presentation, understand that you will basically have pain, like I mentioned, you will have vomiting, you might have fever, it might or might be there, might not be there. Okay. Other than that, these are also the normal signs and symptoms of a pregnancy. So even in normal pregnancy, the patient can have mild abdominal pain. That is called as implantation pain. Okay, when implantation happens, the patient will have mild pain and bleeding. Okay, so that pain can be there. When patient can have vomiting because of increased progesterone and HCG. Okay, and fever also can happen because of the hormones, hormonal changes. Okay, this can also be a symptom of appendicitis. Okay, this can also be a symptom of tuberculosis. Okay, this is going to be a very vague symptomatology, very vague presentation. Okay, that is why till the first half of 20th century, the diagnosis of ectopic pregnancy was based on clinical data, because now we have a device called ultrasound, which was not there. So previously they had a lot of difficulty to diagnose ectopic pregnancy because of this particular reason. Okay, so the next thing is, as I told you, like what is ectopic pregnancy? It is just a pregnancy in an abnormal area. Okay, so that by itself is not going to cause any symptom. Okay, only if there are secondary lesions, they are going to have symptomatology. Okay, that is what was mentioned here. Okay, that explaining these difficulties like lies in the fact that symptoms associated with ectopic gestation arise not directly from presence of the growing ovum, the fallopian tube, but from certain secondary lesions. What are those lesions? Those lesions are basically your intraperitoneal flooding, that is from tubal abortion or tubal rupture. So you have a tube, you have a uterus. Okay, so when the bleeding happens, when the embryo goes for abortion, it can either come this way or that way. So when it comes via this way, it causes intraperitoneal bleeding or flooding, which is called tubal abortion. Okay, if this ruptures and comes out, it is going to be called as tubal rupture. Okay, and intratubal bleeding leading to acute distension of the tube and abdominal ostia being sealed. What is the abdominal ostia? This is going to be the abdominal ostia. So if this side of the ostia, which is the fallopian tube, is sealed, the tube is going to get distended. Okay, and I want you to understand that like any abdominal organ, okay, pain is going to be they are going to be sensitive for pain by distension, because nervous supply is going to be on the serosa or the peritoneum most commonly, right? So thing is, you are going to have in the small intestine, you're going to have mucosa, submucosa, muscularis, and then serosa. Okay, and the serosa will be having nervous system, nervous supply. Adhe mari, in the fallopian tube, you will have mucosa. There is no submucosa. Okay, no submucosa in the fallopian tube, muscularis and serosa, and then you will have the broad ligament, which is going to be the parietal peritoneum. Okay, and this parietal peritoneum has nerve supply. Okay, what happens is when there is distension, no, this nerve endings will get stretched and that will cause pain. That is why you will have pain in abdominal distension. When there is large bowel or small bowel distension, when there is fallopian tube distension, then there is gallbladder distension, and there is hepatomegaly. Okay, and that hepatomegaly is like acute hepatomegaly, like for example Budd-Chiari syndrome, or even the epigastric pain in preeclampsia, right? In severe preeclampsia, one of the signs of imminent eclampsia is going to be epigastric pain. That is because of acute inflammation of the liver, causing the liver to expand in size, causing the stretch of the Glissen's capsule, which is having nervous supply, thereby causing pain. Okay. The next thing is going to be progressive or recurrent hemorrhage leading to the formation of a clot, that is pelvic hematoma. Okay, and that hematoma can be anywhere. Okay, it can be in the porch of Douglas or in the broad ligament or in the around the end of the tube also. Okay, and then if this get infected, this is going to come ancestor collection or like it can cause a pyoma or can also cause peritonitis. Okay, so these are going to be the clinical presentations. Okay, so there is a triad for ectopic pregnancy, like I told you. That is basically going to be vaginal bleeding, amenorrhea, and this is the most important concept. Okay, ipsilateral abdominal pain. Okay, you have like 20-30 differential diagnoses for abdominal pain. Okay, so abdominal pain is going to be a very vague like point in the slide. Vaginal bleeding, okay, you will not have vaginal bleeding in appendicitis, right? So you can differentiate it from others. Amenorrhea, you will have to ask history or do a UPT. So UPT positive means you will come to a conclusion that this is going to be most commonly a ectopic pregnancy. And vaginal bleeding also, it is not necessary that the patient should have vaginal bleeding all the time. Most of the time they have vaginal bleeding, but not necessary, because In certain ectopics, the location is such that the bleeding does not happen that easily. Okay, so that is going to be there. And the other symptoms like this, like this nausea, breast tenderness, and urinary frequency, all these are actually symptoms of pregnancy. Okay, because every pregnancy will have breast tenderness or breast heaviness, they'll have nausea, and they'll have urinary frequency because of like the either the gravid uterus compressing on the uh, bladder. But here the most common cause is hemoperitoneum, like that bleeding. No, that bleeding in the pouch of Douglas will actually see. This is the bladder. This is the uterus. This is the POD. Bleeding in this POD will actually compress the bladder. Okay, and that by causing increased urinary frequency. This is the most common cause for urinary frequency in ectopic pregnancy. Okay, and then shoulder pain is because of again hemoperitoneum. This is going to go and like irritate the diaphragm, thereby causing the shoulder pain, causing a referred neuralgia. Okay. So, and vasomotor disturbances like vertigo and syncope usually happen in early shock. Okay. And that is why you have something called as a shock index, which is actually heart rate divided by systolic blood pressure. Okay. The normal shock index is 0.5 to 0.7. But if it is more than 0.85, it is early shock. And if the patient systolic blood pressure is less than 110, it is going to be early shock. So you need to find out this stage and you need to start treating the patient for shock. Okay. The thing is, this shock index is not just used for ectopic pregnancy. It's actually used for any kind of shock. Okay. But since like patients with acute ectopic pregnancy will present with shock, they are using this to find out how much shock that the patient is having. Okay. And other signs of physical examination is going to be a Cullen sign. Okay. The problem with Cullen sign is it is actually going to be a bluish black appearance of around the umbilicus. Okay. And Cullen described this in 1980, and he labeled it for ruptured extrauterine pregnancy. Okay. But the problem is this is seen in many other conditions also. Okay. And this person called Ransoff, no, in 1906, the same sign he described for a ruptured bile duct. Okay. But in this condition, that umbilicus was actually more like having like it was more in a yellowish like orange color than the bluish black color. And this person called Hofstadter, no, like he also observed a bluish displacement of an umbilical hernia. It's like all these signs are going to be very very similar. Okay, so you should not confuse them on examination. But all these things are obsolete in clinical practice because like you diagnosis of ectopic pregnancy is not going to be based on your Cullen sign. It's going to be based on something else, which I'll tell you in some more time. Okay. Okay. So this is going to be the conditions which are associated with Cullen sign. You will have pancreatitis, you have pancreatic trauma, ectopic pregnancy, ruptured aortic or iliac aneurysms, ruptured spleen, hematomas, bleeding, ruptured bile duct, perforated ulcer, hepatocellular carcinoma. See, you have around 10 to 15 conditions here. So you cannot tell that this is specific for one particular diagnosis like ectopic pregnancy. Okay, so this is going to be one more flow chart. Okay, so how do you diagnose? How do you diagnose your ectopic pregnancy? Okay, that is going to be depending on two things. You're going to do basically. You're going to have one is your lab value, and others is going to be your scan finding. Okay, so that I will explain now. Okay, where is that diagram? Then misplaced that diagram. Okay, okay, no problem. I will just draw that diagram for you. Okay, so when you have you require two things for diagnosis. Okay, diagnosis of ectopic pregnancy is going to be based on basically two things, but we have other things also, other things also there. Okay, you will have lab findings, and then you will have imaging, and then you will have biopsy findings. Okay. In lab, you will have two tests. Okay, you will have two things you will test for. One is going to be your beta HCG. Other is going to be your serum progesterone. Okay. In imaging, you are going to have multiple things, but most commonly it is going to be your transvaginal ultrasound, and others is going to be your CT or your MRI scan. Okay, these are something which you don't use commonly. Okay, basically it's going to be your PVS. And biopsy, and one more thing is going to be cultosynthesis. Right. Okay. So we'll deal basically with HCG and TVS because these things are very important. These are going to be the most important aspects for diagnosis. Okay. For HCG, you will have various levels. Okay. And the concept is that you cannot diagnose ectopic pregnancy with just one particular value of HCG alone. Okay. This is going to be based on the concept that the HCG is going to be following a log linear curve, which means it is going to rise like this, like the curve of coronavirus. Okay. This is going to be called as a log linear curve. Okay. And it can be detected in the blood from 8th day of LH surge. Okay. So after 8th day of LH surge, you can start to detect the serum beta HCG. Right. Now what happens is HCG levels will also tell you to a certain extent what is going to be the gestational age of the embryo. Okay. Suppose a patient who is coming is not able to tell her LMP properly. Okay. At that time, the amount of HCG is going to tell us what is going to be the approximate gestation age. Okay. So the HCG levels will actually increase and it will plateau at around 100,000 international units per liter. At this level, it will start plateauing. Okay, this is going to be much more common. Okay, this is progesterone. I'm sorry for the bad handwriting. This is progesterone. Okay, serum progesterone. Right. Okay. So, what is going to, like the important thing about beta HCG is that this curve, no, because of this curve, this is going to be the time here in the x-axis. So at different times, the level will be different. This is still your 10 to 12 weeks of gestation. Okay, so based on the HCG levels, you can to a certain extent come to a conclusion about what is the gestation age of this current pregnancy. Okay, and one more thing is because this is going to rise, no, this is the curve for a normal pregnancy. If this does not increase, it means that the pregnancy is an abnormal pregnancy. Okay, and that can be anything, not just ectopic pregnancy. So with HCG, you will find if the pregnancy is a normal pregnancy or not, or if it's an abnormal pregnancy or not. Okay, and one more thing you can find is if it is going to be at the what is the gestation age of the pregnancy. With progesterone, you should understand that progesterone levels will almost be constant for the first, 10 weeks approximately, let us say. So, level of progesterone will be constant. So, there is no log curve. It will be constant to a certain extent. Okay. So, normal pregnancy, what will happen is progesterone levels will be more than 20 nanogram. Right. For a dying pregnancy, it will be less than 5 nanogram. So with the progesterone value, we can tell if the pregnancy is normal healthy pregnancy, with a healthy pregnancy or a dying pregnancy. Okay. And this will give you a permutation and combination. Okay. What happens if there's a normal HCG value, the normal healthy pregnancy? It means that it is most commonly a intrauterine pregnancy. Okay. It can be a intrauterine pregnancy most commonly. Okay. What happens if it is a abnormal pregnancy and a dying pregnancy? It can mean it is going to be most commonly a spontaneous abortion or a missed abortion or a complete abortion or an inevitable abortion. Okay, so basically it is an abortion. Okay, so let us see another different combination. So what happens if it is a normal beta HCG value? Okay, but it is progesterone is dying. Okay, this means there's something wrong with your test, and it can most commonly be a it can be an ectopic pregnancy, but this is very rare. It can most commonly be an abortion again here also. Okay, or some other like something like a delayed conception, right? But what happens if this is going to be an abnormal HCG with a normal healthy pregnancy? This has a higher chance of coming out as a ectopic pregnancy. Okay, this is the reason why we have to do why you read both values HCG and progesterone. But clinically, we are not doing progesterone. We won't use it for ectopic pregnancy. We are using it for other conditions like PCOS and all, and infertility. But for us, we'll use only HCG for ectopic pregnancy, right? And imaging. What is the use of imaging? Imaging is going to tell us where exactly the embryo is implanted. Okay. CT MRI we are not going to use much very commonly, so we will not discuss about that. What is the findings of a TVS? What is TVS first? TVS is called as a transvaginal ultrasound. Okay, so the probe is going to be a long probe which is going to insert into the vagina. Okay, here is going to be the piezoelectric material. This is a high frequency probe. Okay, so you are going to get a very good image, right? Okay, so you need to correlate. See, any scan machine will have an inbuilt software wherein you can measure the gestational sac and all. You can measure the yolk sac. You can do this, find the CRL, and you can come tell the gestational age. Okay. Thing is, why you are going to do beta HCG is because with the level of HCG also, you can find out what is the gestation age for that particular pregnancy. Okay, so there is something called as the discriminatory zone. Okay, or discriminatory level. That is the level of beta HCG. Okay, discriminate is going to be the level of beta HCG where you can see the embryo and its products. Okay, so since it is going to be the level in which a person can see by scan, this is going to depend on the scan center, the radiologist. Okay, but universally the amount of HCG is going to be 1500 to 2000 international units per liter. This is this internationally acclaimed discriminatory zone for ectopic pregnancy. The reason why I am telling you this is because at this level of like beta HCG, you should be able to find the yolk sac, the gestational sac and the yolk sac in the scan. If you are not able to find, means there are something abnormal is happening. Okay, and why you need this is because suppose the patient is coming with HCG value of 1000. Okay, you cannot tell that this patient is having ectopic pregnancy because only after this value you can see the pregnancy normally. Okay, so this is going to be an early pregnancy. It is going to be early for you to diagnose that this is an ectopic pregnancy. Suppose the patient is having a value of 5000 and you are not seeing, you are not able to see the like embryo in the scan, not just in the endometrial cavity, but even in the adnexa. Okay, that is outside the endometrial cavity. If the embryo is not, you are not able to visualize, means it means that there's something wrong. It could have been what? It could have been a missed abortion most commonly. Okay, it could have been that the patient is having an incomplete abortion and almost all the products have almost all the products have been gone. Okay, so this is why you are going to require to do a beta HCG value and a transvaginal ultrasound. Okay, so in the TVS, no, what will happen is you will have the image like this. Okay, this is going to be you will see the uterus in this way. Okay, I will try to show the image to you in some time after the class. Okay, this is going to be the uterus. This is going to be the anterior view and the posterior view, and you will have the endometrial cavity here. Okay, you will have three distinct lines. Those three lines will tell you the endometrial cavity, which is normal. Okay, so if you have this particular cavity, this cavity is not there, means there's going to be it is telling something is wrong. Okay, it can be anything. It can be even a retained product of conception. It's called RPOC, or it can be the residual cost. All that I'll explain to you. Okay, and what do you do by cultosynthesis? Okay, cultosynthesis is actually you're in the vagina. Okay, you are going to you're going to put a speculum, and you're going to retract the posterior vaginal wall downwards, and you will have the cervix here. Okay, the cervix will be here. Okay, this is going to be the superior, and this is going to be the inferior part, and you're going to take a 16 to 18 gauge needle. Okay, inject and then aspirate in the syringe and see what is the content. Okay, and this content, no, you're supposed to put it on a glass slide. Okay, and see what is happening. If it is going to be a clear fluid, it is basically peritoneal fluid, and there is not much of peritoneal no, like there's no hemoperitoneum, so the test is negative, right? So you are getting blood. Okay, and that blood is actually can be in two ways. First scenario, that blood is either you're getting a clot, a formed clot, or blood which is not clotting. Okay, what does this mean? What does this imply? This means that the hemoperitoneum has already been established. Okay, hemoperitoneum has already been established. So all the blood which has formed the hemoperitoneum has clotted. That is why you've got the clot. Okay, and in spite of that, if there is minimal blood which is not clotted, that has come out from the syringe into your test and all, it means that that blood has used up its clotting factors. Okay, so that blood is not having any clotting factors, thereby it is not going to clot in your glass slide. You understand? So that means it is it has like there is hemoperitoneum has been happening for some time. Okay, now we are getting another type of blood. We are getting active red bleeding. Okay, it means it is either new hemoperitoneum. Okay, or you have actually injured a vessel, because this blood will clot once you put on the glass slide. You understand? So this is going to be a positive test. Okay, what other things you can see is you can actually see pus sometimes. So that means it is a like there's a peritoneal infection, or that there's some infection in the cavity. You can sometimes see fecal material. Okay, that is because either there is fecal peritonitis because of the rupture, bowel or something, or it can be that because you have actually punctured the rectosigmoid. Okay, this is the region which you can actually injure during doing a cultosynthesis. You have actually injured the rectosigmoid. So this is going to be the outcomes of cultosynthesis, and this is not being done nowadays. Okay, because it's very and it's not very sensitive, and you can actually get false values, and it's very cumbersome to do this test. Okay, biopsy is like you're going to do a endometrial sampling. You can do it either as a dilatation and curettage, or you can do it as a Whipple sample. Okay, the concept is you are going to have an ectopic pregnancy, right? So let us say the ectopic pregnancy is here. Okay, so since the patient is pregnant now, the patient's endometrium will actually change to be able to support the embryo to grow. Okay, so this embryo, this endometrium will have decidual formation. Decidua will form. Okay, and this is supposed to get implanted here because this is much more like beneficial for the growth of the fetus in the long term, but that does not happen. Okay, so when you do a dilatation and curettage now, or do a sample now, no, you will take a sample from the endometrium. Okay, and that sample will have only the decidua. Okay, that will not have this any fetal part or chorionic villi, which is what I'm going to test. Okay, so normally if you're going to do a DNC or a curettage in a like intrauterine pregnancy, you will have the decidua and the chorionic villi in the sample. Okay, but in the in ectopic pregnancy, since it is not there in the uterine cavity, you will not have the chorionic villi. So if the decidua is just only decidual cast is being seen in the endometrial sample, it means that it is a chance of ectopic pregnancy. Again, understand that this is not going to be a diagnostic test. This is not a gold standard because suppose I am taking a sample from this particular area. This will not have any chorionic villi. But the pregnancy is here means it is an intrauterine pregnancy only. But I would have missed that. So this is not a reliable test. Okay. The most reliable gold standard test for ectopic pregnancy is actually laparoscopy or laparotomy. That is, you are going to go inside the abdomen and find out whether the pregnancy is in the cavity or not. Okay. So now we have come to we have discussed about different methods of diagnosis. Okay, so there's a diagnostic flowchart which has been mentioned in SHA. Okay, I want you to go read that because Williams and all is not that Williams does not have a very good flowchart. It is not a practical flowchart that we use. Okay, so as I told you, the patient is coming with symptoms of abdominal pain, vomiting, and amenorrhea. You are doing a pregnancy test, right? It is coming as weakly positive or positive. First, we'll finish off positive. See, it is positive. HCG is more than 1000. Okay, that is like 1500 or 2000, which we told as the discriminative zone. You are doing a scan, right? Scan, you are finding normal pregnancy, normal scan. That is a false positive test or a too early scan. You repeat HCG after 48 hours. Okay. Next, you are going to get an intrauterine pregnancy. You repeat ultrasound afterwards if it is an IVF pregnancy to exclude concomitant ectopic pregnancy. What is this called? A patient having a intrauterine pregnancy and one more ectopic pregnancy. What is this called? Can anyone tell me? There's a special name for this particular. Can anyone tell me in chat what is this pregnancy called? Anyone? Okay. So this is going to be called as a heterotopic pregnancy. Okay. Why is this important? I'll let you know in some time. Right. And the next thing is you're going to have an empty sac. So empty sac means it can be either two things. It can be either a too early scan or a blighted ovum. Okay, blighted ovum is like fertilization has occurred, but the ovum is not there. Okay, like you just have one empty sac, but there's no embryo inside. Okay, that is called a blighted ovum. So in this, it can also be early pregnancy. So we can actually repeat HCG after a few days. Okay. Next thing would be unaxial mass. Okay, empty uterus is empty. Okay. So here we have to do a laparoscopy because the patient is hemodynamically stable, and we just have to confirm because this is going to be the diagnostic gold standard test. Okay, and sometimes just the diagnostic laparoscopy will be sufficient. Okay, if the patient is still having complaints of pain and all. Okay, okay. Weakly positive. No, we'll go into this. Patient is having a missed abortion or early ectopic pregnancy or early uterine pregnancy. You are doing the HCG value. and the titer is falling, and irregular sac is there, it means it is going to be a abortion, either a missed abortion or a bedded one. Titer is rising, but it is less than 66%. Okay, I'll tell you about this in detail now. Okay, when I told like we are going to do a HCG after 48 hours, the reason is because the log linear curve of HCG is going to be such that after interval of 48 hours, the HCG should have been increased by 66%. That is like around 50 to 60%, it should actually increase in a normal pregnancy. If that increase is not there, it means it is a abnormal pregnancy. That is why we need a we have to, that is how we interpret a log linear curve. Okay, so if that is not rising, you do a transvaginal ultrasound and repeat HCG, or else you go for a diagnostic laparoscopy. Okay, and if it is a normal titer, it is rising and the sac is there in the uterus, it is a normal pregnancy. You can just go for a normal routine EN-CAP. Okay, this is going to be the diagnostic flowchart for ectopic pregnancy, right? So let me just I would have told you in the beginning of the class, right, that before 1800s, most of the patients who had ectopic pregnancy usually died. Some of them survived. How did they survive? I'll come to that now. Okay. So for any anything, there will be a management in three different ways. One, you will have a expected management where you don't do anything, you don't intervene, you just observe the patient, monitor them, and let nature take its course. Second thing would be a medical management, and the third thing would be a surgical management. Okay. So let me just touch upon the expected management first. So what is expected management is you just observe the patient. So the patient can end up in one of these three ways. One is the patient can go for tubal abortion. Okay. Once the tubal abortion has happened, it can actually have two endpoints. One, the abortion can regress and the patient can get better on the hormone. That is the one condition where the patient will be fine without any intervention. Another thing is the patient abortion going for spontaneous reimplantation. That is, after the embryo gets expelled from the tube into the peritoneal cavity, the embryo can get implanted there and then start growing there. Okay, so that will cause secondary abdominal pregnancy. Okay, and the treatment for that, as I told you, is going to be surgery. Okay, so she can go in for tubal rupture. So again, if it goes for that, she's going to require surgery, right? And sometimes it can actually spontaneously resolve inside the tube also. Okay, so patients with these two conditions, okay, who spontaneously regressed either after the tubal abortion or in the tube itself, they are going to have survived this condition. Okay, so women in history who had just had these two particular situations would have survived ectopic pregnancy. Others would not have survived ectopic pregnancy most of the time. Okay. There are a few other conditions also, which I can tell you later. Okay. Next, we'll finish off surgical management because it's much more simpler. Okay. Surgical management is basically two things. You are going to have either laparoscopy or laparotomy. Okay. Nothing else. Right. What is the difference between laparoscopy and laparotomy? Laparoscopy is going to be a minimally invasive surgery. Okay, so when you are going to do laparoscopy, the patient is going to be hemodynamically stable. Okay. Unless and until the patient is hemodynamically stable, you cannot going to go in for a laparoscopy. Laparotomy is going to be the endpoint. Like any patient who's coming with acute ectopic pregnancy who is very serious is going to end up doing a laparotomy. Okay, so this patient is going to land up. Let us say this patient has gone to a general surgeon. Okay, the general surgeon, because they have many other diagnosed multiple like DDs in their mind, they will go for a midline laparotomy incision. Okay, so this is the umbilicus. They'll put an incision here. Okay, this is the anterior superior iliac sinus pubic incisive. They'll put an incision here and they'll operate. Okay, if she lands up to a gynecologist, what will happen is they're going to put a suprapubic transverse incision. Okay, this is the pubic symphysis. They'll put a suprapubic transverse incision and operate. Okay. Thing is because surgeons are most comfortable putting a midline lateral incision because that is the thing which they use more commonly. Gynecologists, we are more comfortable doing a suprapubic transverse incision because we are using it for LSCS also. Okay, and the advantages of both. Advantages of this is going to be it is cosmetic. Okay, it will heal better, but very poor exposure. Right. Since as gynecologists, we are going to deal only with the ovary and the uterus and the adnexa, we are not much concerned about the bowels and all which are going to be here. Since surgeons are much more concerned about the other organs, abdominal organs, they will want to do a midline lateral incision because one, this has the most important advantage. It has better exposure. They can actually have a look at all the organs and they can inspect all the organs and they can actually do a better procedure that way. Okay, but the bad point, the disadvantages are it is not cosmetically appealing. Cosmesis is not there, and it is actually going to heal in a very bad way. Healing is not as good as a suprapubic transverse incision. Okay, and more prone for hernia. This is going to heal better and less prone for hernia. Okay. Okay. So what? See, you are going to do laparoscopy or laparotomy, but what are going to do after that? அது பண்ணி என்ன பண்ண போறீங்க உள்ள என்ன பண்ண போறதா முக்கியம் இப்போ. ஓகேவா? That is going to be either salpingectomy or salpingostomy. Right? Okay, I want you to first, I'll just finish off with ectomy first. Salpingectomy is basically you're going to remove the fallopian tube, right? That is what we do most commonly because mostly if the patient is going to have an ectopic on one side, it means that the tube is injured. So concomitant risk of getting ectopic pregnancy after that is going to be increased. So recurrent ectopic pregnancy will happen. To prevent that, you're going to do salpingectomy on one side. Okay, this can be either complete or partial. Okay, and it is actually better to do complete. The reason is because the fallopian tube, the fimbrial end of the fallopian tube, have a few cells. Okay, these cells will actually fall on the ovary. Okay, and so when the ovary is ovulating, what will happen is it will actually have small follicles upsetting. That will actually make the surface irregular. That will open up the ovary to the inside of the ovary, right? If these cells and go and fall inside, in the future they will be the precursor cells for ovarian cancer. Okay, they will be the precursor cells for surface epithelial tumors of the ovary. Okay, that is why they are now the certain, like this is all new guidelines, like new research has come up and they're telling that it is better to do a fimbrectomy in case you're going to do a salpingectomy also, so that you are reducing the chance of getting CA ovary for that particular patient on that particular side, right? This is about salpingectomy. What is salpingostomy is you have the fallopian tube, you have the embryo here, you put a linear cut on the tube and then you're going to expel the embryo and then you leave it as such. Okay, you don't like suture. That is because once you suture, there is a risk of healing by fibrosis and that will cause constriction and cause stenosis of the fallopian tube, thereby increasing the risk of fallopian ectopic pregnancy in the future. Okay, and again, when is salpingostomy done? It is done when the patient is hemodynamically stable and the patient wants to preserve fertility. Okay, say that the patient's other tube has been removed for some other condition or the other tube has been blocked. You want to do a fertility sparing procedure, then you do a salpingostomy. And HCG levels would be somewhere between 6,000 or less than 6,000 to 8,000. Okay. The reason why I'm telling you this is because level of beta HCG is going to correspond to the depth of infiltration of the embryo. Okay. If the embryo is infiltrated very deep, it means it will be very difficult for you to remove the embryo without damaging the tube. Okay. If you damage the tube, there is no purpose of doing salpingostomy, right? So if the HCG value is higher, it means that the depth is higher, and thereby the risk of that surgery failing is going to be higher. That is why you're going to do it only if the HCG value is less than 6,000. Okay. And the problem is, if you don't do it properly, it will lead to persistent ectopic pregnancy, wherein the patient, you will have a little bit of chorionic villus remaining in the tube, and that will keep secreting HCG, and your HCG levels will not go back to normal, will not decrease to normal. Okay, that is a problem with the salpingostomy, right? Okay. Now we'll go to the medical management. Okay. So medical management, you have to understand a few things. Okay, for whom do you have medical management? Medical management is actually going to be, see, these are all the different associations of obstetrics and gynecology throughout the world. This is for Europe. Okay, let me change the color. Okay. This is for Europe. This is for international. This is for America. This is for again Europe. This is like DMK. This is like ADMK, something like that. Okay, so thing is, the patient who should have no significant pain. Patient should have unruptured ectopic pregnancy. The size of the lesion should be less than 35 millimeters. HCG should be less than 1,500 to 1,000. It should be between 1,500 to 5,000. Okay. And intrauterine pregnancy should not be there. That means if it is there, means it is going to be a heterotopic pregnancy. I told now about heterotopic pregnancy, I'll tell you, because if you have a heterotopic pregnancy, you're going to, like, the HCG levels will be contributed by both the intrauterine pregnancy and the ectopic pregnancy. Okay, so you cannot monitor your patient of ectopic pregnancy with just the HCG values. That is going to interfere with your diagnosis, treatment, and follow-up. Next thing is, heterotopic pregnancy is most commonly seen in patients who have been getting treatment for infertility. Okay, so in those conditions, patients will have spent a lot of time and money, and they will be emotionally attached to that pregnancy. So we cannot just about go and tell them that you have ectopic pregnancy, you're going to abort all the children for you. No, that is not a very professional thing to do. In that scenario, you should actually plan to remove only the ectopic pregnancy and make sure that the pregnancy in the uterine cavity is survived. Okay. And the thing is, if you are going to do medical management for that particular scenario, that will fail because the medical management will affect both the intrauterine pregnancy and the pregnancy in the fallopian tube. Okay. We will come to that in detail in a few slides. Okay. So you will understand that almost all the like associations come to a same understanding. Okay, everybody wants a normal HCG level. Everybody wants a patient who is not in pain. Everybody wants a patient in which the size is not less than 35 millimeters. Everybody wants a patient who is going to come for follow-up because it is going to take some time. Okay. And everybody does not want to have a heterotopic pregnancy. This is like all the political parties in our country agreeing on one particular thing, which is not going to happen ever. Okay. So something similar to that has happened in this particular topic for us. Okay. So who are the patients who are a good candidate for ectopic pregnancy? Thing is, again, this is what mentioned here. Everything here will come on rupture mass, size of the HCG levels and stable, and no intrauterine pregnancy. The only extra point given is there is no embryonic cardiac activity. Okay, that is a very important point. If the patient is having embryonic cardiac activity, the success of medical management is going to come down significantly. Okay, and whom is it contraindicated for? It is going to be contraindicated for patients who are unstable hemodynamically, who have ruptured. So all these who are not satisfied, they are going to come here. Sensitivity to methotrexate, because that is the drug of choice for medical management, and breastfeeding. Other than this, problems caused by methotrexate, like active pulmonary disease, because that will cause pulmonary damage, liver disease called because it will cause renal damage, chronic liver disease, pre-existing blood dyscharisia, immunodeficiency. All this is because methotrexate is going to affect these organs. Okay. Okay. So what are the drugs and the regimens used for medical management? As I told you, we are going to use methotrexate. Okay. You have intramuscular and oral. Oral, we are not using at all. It is completely stupid. Why? Because the dose of HCG is going to be, the methotrexate is going to be 50 milligram IM, okay, or 1 milligram per kg, 50 milligram per IM per meter square, okay. So, for you to achieve this, you have to take what 4 into 5, 20 tablets of oral tablets of methotrexate, which is completely, like it's like eating rice, okay, or it's like Devyani eating sleeping pills in Panchadandram, okay. So you're going to go for a intramuscular regimen. That can also be divided into single dose, double dose, and multiple doses. We'll deal about that. Methotrexate can also be given along with mifepristone. Okay, but practically we are not doing that. Again, methotrexate can be given with gefitinib, which is a EGFR antagonist. Okay, this will cause a faster decline of serum HCG. All these things are for meat. Okay, wow. Because these are not mentioned in textbooks. This is actually in research material. This will come up in the next edition of maybe Williams Gynecology, and this will they might ask you this in NEET if they want to ask a difficult question. Okay. Other surgically administered medications. What do you mean by surgically administered medications? That is under scan guidance, or you're going to like inject this drug into the embryo, which is methotrexate, hyperosmolar glucose, or potassium chloride. This can be used for treatment of heterotopic pregnancy. Okay. Okay. So why are we giving methotrexate? What is the pharmacology of methotrexate? It is a folic acid antagonist. It inhibits DNA synthesis. Okay, that is why you are going to be worried about immunodeficiency. You are going to be worried about pre-blood dysphasia because like blood cells are going to have a very short lifetime. So all the fastly reproducing cells will get affected by chemotherapeutic drugs. Understand that? Okay. So it is cleared by the kidneys. That is why you're going to have a patient with proper renal function to give this drug. Okay. So based on the doses, you're going to have 3 different doses for methotrexate. 3 different doses are there. One is going to be low dose, 7.5 to 2.5 milligram weekly. This is going to be for rheumatologic disorders. Okay. Intermediate dose for 50 milligram per meter square or 1 milligram per kg for ectopic pregnancy. Okay. And high dose for pregnancies. I want you to understand this. This 50 milligram dose, no, that is actually this low dose is actually your DMARD. Using methotrexate as a disease-modifying anti-rheumatoid drug. Okay, for rheumatoid arthritis. Okay, and one more thing is you can use glucagon as a rescue therapy for patients with methotrexate, but it is not used much in ectopic pregnancy because you are going to use mostly only as 1 or 2 doses of methotrexate. Okay, that is not going to cause as much harm. But the patient is having symptomatology, the patient is having symptoms of methotrexate toxicity, then you can give glucagon. That is not contraindicated in any way. Okay. So as I told you, pre-treatment, what you should do? You should have the HCG concentration and vaginal ultrasound and blood group. Why? Because if it is orange negative patient, you should give anti-D immunoglobulin after the treatment. Complete blood count, hemoglobin, liver and renal function test to find out the liver and the renal function, and to discontinue the folic acid supplement because this is going to interfere with your treatment and cause treatment failure. Okay, and this going to avoid the patient to ask the patient to avoid non-steroidal anti-inflammatory medication because that is also going to affect your drug interaction. It will also cause drug interaction. Okay. Okay. So what is going to be the regimen? You have, as told you, 3 regimens: single dose, multiple dose, and 2 dose regimen. Okay. So single dose regimen is basically 50 milligrams on day 0, and then you test on 0, 4, and 7. 3 tests. Okay. HCG level will decline. Okay, if it should decline 15% between day 4 and day 7. If that happens, it is responding to treatment. A single dose is sufficient. If the decline is not 15%, you can actually add a second dose. In the first dose regimen, you can actually add a second dose on day 7. Okay, this is going to be single dose regimen, and this is going to be the additional dose. Additional dose. Okay, in 2-dose regimen, what you're going to have is you're going to have 2 doses on day 0 and day 4. Again, you're going to test on 0, 4, and 7. Okay, again check for HCG between days 4 and 7. If it does not decline by 15% or more, you can give an additional dose. Okay, on day 7, if the decline is not sufficient enough. Okay, so this is going to be single and double dose regimen. What is going to be a multiple dose regimen? It is you're going to have drugs on alternate days. Okay, so 0, 2, 4, 6, like that. Okay, HCG is going to measure on 0, 1, 3, 5, 7. This one is going to be different than the other two. Okay, the HCG value should decrease 15% from the previous value. If that does not happen, okay, after 5 maximum doses of methotrexate, you can actually wait for day 14 to day 21 and see. Even in spite of that, if it does not decline, then you have to go for laparoscopic surgery. Okay, so this is going to be the management for the multi-dose regimen, right? Okay. So this is going to be the success rate based on the HCG levels for single dose regimen. Okay, so if you can see that success rate is higher if the HCG level is lower. Okay, and again adverse effects, as I have told you, like it will affect the rapidly dividing tissue. So GI in the columns, so nausea, vomiting will be there, flatulence will be there, stomatitis will be there, bone mass suppression will be there, lung involvement, fibrosis will be there, liver cirrhosis will be there, renal failure will be there, vaginal spotting can be there. Okay, and one more thing is the abdominal pain. Abdominal pain 2 to 3 days after administration is actually because of the effect of the drug. Okay, so once the drug starts acting, no, it will actually cause the implanted embryo to get it will actually detach the implanted embryo. Okay, and when that happens, okay, this is called there'll be some mild spotting and pain. That is called as separation pain. Okay, so you should not confuse the separation pain with the failure of the medical management, and you should not think that the medical management has failed and she is going for obstructive pregnancy, I should go for surgery. No. If this pain is there, you would do a ultrasound and you confirm the diagnosis, and then in case rupture is there, means you can go for surgery, or else you can actually give her paracetamol and you can actually wait for some time for the pain to resolve. Okay, so the take-home message for medical management is going to be that success rate is close to 90% for medical management. Okay, so if you have to choose your patients properly for medical management, and second dose may be required in 30% of the cases. Okay, and methotrexate will not interfere with future pregnancy, fertility, or recurrent. It is not going to increase the risk of pregnancy also, active pregnancy also. Okay, and again, most importantly, before administration of methotrexate, find out that there is no intrauterine pregnancy. Okay, okay. So this is going to be the medical management of a tubal ectopic pregnancy, right? Okay. So we will now go to and discuss about few of the other rare causes of ectopic pregnancy. Okay, so what other causes of ectopic pregnancy are going to be that other non-tubal causes, which is going to be your abdominal pregnancy, ovarian pregnancy, and so forth. Right. Okay. So ovarian ectopic pregnancy is going to be 3% of the incidence of all ectopic pregnancies. This is a criteria. Okay. So this person called Spiegelberger in 1878 put up a criteria wherein ipsilateral tube is intact and distinct from the ovary, ectopic pregnancy occupies the ovary. Okay, I'll make a diagram and I'll clarify to you. Okay, so you are going to have a pregnancy. You're going to have, you're having a uterus. Uh, you're going to have a fallopian tube, and then fimea is there, ovary is there. Okay, so you're having a ectopic pregnancy. What he is telling is this ipsilateral tube should be intact. It should be separately visualized from the ovary. First point. Ectopic pregnancy should occupy the ovary. Second point. Third point is the ectopic pregnancy is connected to the ovary with the uterus with the utero-ovarian ligament. This is going to be the utero-ovarian ligament. It will be here beneath the fallopian tube. Okay. So this is going to be connected. Third point also satisfied. Fourth point is ovarian tissue should be demonstrated histologically in the placental. Like they should have placental tissue in the ovary. That means after surgery. Okay, when you're removing this, this part, this placenta and the embryo should also have ovarian tissue. This is going to be the fourth part. So if this if they satisfy all these 4 points, it is going to be a ovarian ectopic pregnancy. Okay. So the next slide I will show you. Next is going to be abdominal ectopic pregnancy. Okay. Abdominal ectopic pregnancy can either be primary or secondary. Like I told you, right? Primary means the ovum and the sperm are actually fertilizing outside the fallopian tube. Okay, they are fertilizing and it is happening in the abdomen. That is going to be primary abdomen. Secondary abdominal pregnancies, the fertilization is happening somewhere else, like in the fallopian tube or in the ovary or some places, and that is going to go to the abdomen. That is going to be secondary. This is going to be primary abdominal pregnancy. Okay, primary abdominal pregnancy is actually quite rare compared to secondary abdominal pregnancy. Remember, we studied about fistula and the fallopian tube, cauterization of the fallopian tube. All this and all can cause secondary pregnancy, secondary abdominal pregnancy. Even that tubal abortion and causing reimplantation of the embryo, that is also going to be a cause of secondary pregnancy. Okay, so the first documented report of successful abdominal pregnancy was in 1500s by a Swiss person. He performed surgery on his wife and both the mother and child survived. I have no idea how this happened. Okay, maybe some article, something, I don't know. But the first modern description was in 1887. And then the criteria for abdominal pregnancy was described by Studiford in 1942. Okay, if they ask you a question in NEET, it can be based on this criteria also. Okay, and for finalists, this can be asked as a short note also for you in your exams. The criteria for ovarian Spielberg criteria for abdominal Studiford criteria, and criteria for cervical is going to be Rubin's criteria. Okay, I'll come to that in some time. Okay. So again, in the criteria, what you have, that you have normal fallopian tubes and ovaries, both are normal. Once again, okay, and pregnancy, no evidence of uteroplacental fistula, as I mentioned. Okay, third thing would be pregnancy is related exclusively to the peritoneal surface. That is, the implantation has happened somewhere in the peritoneum, most commonly the mesentery or in the bowel. Okay, or in the omentum. So these are the places where the embryo will actually go on. So this is to why? Because this is to eliminate the possibility of secondary implantation after the primary nidation in the fallopian tubes. What this means is this is criteria for primary abdominal pregnancy. This is to eliminate the secondary causes, like the fertilization happens in the fallopian tube and the this one happens after that. The reimplantation happens after that. To prevent that, to prevent secondary pregnancy, abdominal pregnancy to coming into this criteria, they put that point. Okay. So I'm going to show you a few of the images. Right. So here, this is an MRI. Okay. This is the sagittal section of the MRI. Here you can see this is the uterus. This is the bladder, this is the uterus. This is going to be the endometrium. This line, no, where I drawn, that is the endometrium. This is the pregnancy, which is outside. So this is going to be adrenal pregnancy. Again, this is the bladder, this is the pubic bone, this is the spine. Here you can, this is going to be the endometrium. Okay, this endometrium is not just like having the CDO. Okay, and then this is going to be the pregnancy. This is going to have the placental tissue. It's actually many a placental tissue here. Here you can actually see some fertile parts, but here it's a placental tissue. Okay. So how do you manage this abdominal pregnancy? Okay, it is going to be surgery. You are going to do laparotomy. Okay, here you will go for a midline incision because anywhere the placenta is going to get attached, no, that is going to have lot of blood supply. Okay, and that area will bleed like hell. So you cannot expect to do a cosmetic surgery there. This surgery is going to be a life-saving surgery. Okay. Thing is, based on the time when you diagnose this pregnancy, you can actually like do surgery at 2 different time frames. Okay. For example, if you are finding out this patient is having an abdominal pregnancy after 20 weeks, the risk of surgery now and at 40 weeks is going to be the same, almost the same. So you can ask the patient if she wants to continue the pregnancy, and we'll do a laparotomy and take the baby out at 40 weeks. Okay. So if she tells yes, then you have a few conditions that this at 20 weeks the normal scan should be there, normal fetus should be there, normal light curve, and no other comorbidities for the fetus and all should be there, and patients would get admitted in the hospital, continuous monitoring. Okay, so if that happens, you can pull on till term, and then you can do a laparotomy and remove the baby if the baby is a live child. Okay, or else you have to do a laparotomy immediately. Okay, so all these images are about doing a laparotomy when they have diagnosed it less than 20 weeks. Okay, so in this pregnancy, it is attached to the bowel here. This is the placenta. Here, it is attached to the uterus outer surface. Okay, so this is going to be, you can see the fetus here. This is going to be the amniotic cavity, like amniotic fluid inside. Okay, this is going to be the entire cavity. And here, this was attached to the outer surface of the uterus. Once you remove that, you're going to suture the uterus and then close the abdomen. Okay, that is going to be the procedure. Okay. The other thing is going to be a cesarean scar pregnancy. Okay, what do you mean by a cesarean scar pregnancy? Nowadays, we have a lot of patients who are coming and doing a cesarean section. So in this case, what happens is you are going to put a scar. Okay, this is the transvaginal ultrasound. Here you can see this is going to be the uterus. Okay, this is going to be the anterior surface, posterior surface. This thin line you can see that is going to be endometrium. Okay, so an empty uterine cavity and cervical canal should be there. Cervical canal is here, it is now empty. Uterine cavity is empty. Development of gestational sac in the anterior portion of the lower uterine segment. This is the fundus of the uterus. This is the lower uterine segment. You can see the development of sac in the anterior portion of the lower uterine segment. Absence of a healthy myometrium between the bladder and the sac. So sac is here. Myometrium, only very small myometrium is there. And this is where the bladder should be, okay, because the scan is not very nice. You can't see the bladder here, but this is the bladder where the bladder will be. So this is satisfying all the criteria for a cesarean scar pregnancy. What happens is, if this happens here, no, when the sac goes, when the embryo goes, this small amount of myometrium will not be able to support the pregnancy and it will actually rupture. So this will cause uterine rupture when the fetus is growing, and you will have to do a surgical excision of this sac as soon as possible to prevent rupture of the uterus. Okay. Again, one more thing is a corneal pregnancy. What is corneal pregnancy? We have certain anomalous uterus, no, like uterus bidelphys and all, or bicornate uterus. Okay. In the problem will arise with bicoordinate uterus, wherein the pregnancy happens in one particular horn. So you can see this is one horn and this is one horn. Pregnancy has happened in one particular horn. This will not tolerate the completely growth 40 weeks fetus. This will also go in for rupture. Okay, so for in this conditions also, you should also do surgery and remove this horn and suture it completely. Okay, this is going to be corneal pregnancy. This is not very because the patient should have first a bicoordinate uterus, and then she should conceive in this bicoordinate uterus, and then only she'll come to you with abdomen pain, and then you do surgery for her. Okay, the last one is going to be cervical ectopic pregnancy. Right. Okay. So what is cervical ectopic pregnancy? You can see pregnancy is happening in the cervix. Okay, this is the transvaginal ultrasound. Here you can see the endometrium. Here you can see the placenta and the like sac attachment here, the cervix. So this is the Rubin's criteria for diagnosis of cervical pregnancy, where cervical glands must be present. Placenta attachment should be the cervix. Please mute your mic. Please mute your mic. I'm able to hear some disturbance here now. Please mute your mic. And the entrance of the uterine cavity it should be attached. Okay. And fetal elements must be absent from the corpus uteri. That is, this fetus part should not be present in the uterine cavity. So in this you can see there is a fetus here. This is actually a uterus cut in half. Okay. So this is the fundus. This is the anterior and the posterior wall, and this is the cervix. You can see the fetus and the placenta here. Okay. So this is surgical management wherein you do hysterectomy for this patient. Okay, this is going to be the end of the session. Anybody having any doubts? Anybody having any doubts, you can ask now, or we'll finish the session now. Okay, or you can actually ask me that and ask me any doubts in the group. Okay. Okay. So now we are going.